Good evening, welcome to Cooperative Vermont. I'm Matt Cropp.
And I'm Eric Davis.
We're coming to you live from VCAM Studios this Sunday, October 19th, 2014. And we have some interesting video and conversation for you this evening. We'll be starting off with the news and then showing a presentation given by William Azarov of Van City Credit Union, a credit union in Vancouver that does some really interesting work. And then we'll be discussing my recent trip to Quebec City for the International Summit of Cooperatives, which was a very interesting and eye-opening journey. So I spent about 5 days there. But first, the news.
Yeah, so New Economy Week ran this past week, ending yesterday, actually, on Saturday the 18th. And there were several co-op and ownership-related events that took place. And you got to participate in several of them, through the Vermont Employee Ownership Center. Helped to organize some of those events.
And that's a little side news. I am now working part-time for the Vermont Employee Ownership Center, which is exciting. Getting to look into worker co-ops and ESOPs and other ways of kind of broadening ownership amongst companies in Vermont. But so partially that kind of gave me the flexibility to attend some of these events, and actually did some of them with my VEOC hat on. So there are a few different kind of, the whole week was organized by kind of sort of on a national basis, but generally by the Danella Meadows Institute in Vermont. They kind of took charge of making the calendar, figuring out when all the things were going to happen, doing all the little, making sure all the working parts fit together and there wasn't anything too overlapping. So the kind of centerpiece of the week was this Who Owns Vermont event, which happened in Montpelier on Wednesday morning. And it was kind of a really sort of broad, it was kind of interesting in that it brought together kind of a broad group of panelists to talk about this question, who owns Vermont? They had Marjorie Kelly come up from the Democracy Collaborative, which is where Garo Perovitz also works.
Yep.
And she's been involved in the evergreen cooperatives that we've been talking about before. But the Danella Meadows Institute has sort of assembled some data around kind of who owns various aspects of Vermont, and then their conversation. So the conversations included things like finance, who owns Vermont Finance, energy. So someone from the ACORN, which stands for, I think, Addison County Renewables Network or something like that. But it's essentially like kind of a co-op that's been doing this sort of group net metering of solar power. And then someone from an employee-owned company, Chroma Technologies, talking about employee ownership, and then someone from an organization that works on sort of farmer succession and talking about who owns the land in Vermont and kind of how is it used and how is that determined and all of that, and kind of how is land passed on to new farmers. So they had this kind of conversation, and then we broke into four groups, and each group kind of had a particular topic to discuss. So I was in the employee ownership group, talking about sort of worker co-ops and ESOPs and other ways of, other forms of kind of giving employees ownership. And it was an interesting conversation. And then each group kind of reported back what they had talked about. So that was definitely a cool event. And that was in Montpelier. And then that evening there was a short documentary called We the Owners, which looks at employee ownership both in the employee stock ownership plan form and the worker co-op form, and kind of highlights three companies, including New Belgium Brewing, which is an ESOP, and Namaste Solar, which is more of kind of a worker co-op model, and then also an employee-owned construction company. And that was put on by a number of both worker co-ops and ESOPs, and the Vermont Employee Ownership Center. And so the movie was about an hour long, so people kind of mingled, and then there's sort of a discussion about both why, what the benefits are of employee ownership, what are the challenges, how does it function, kind of, So it was a good conversation following the film. And then the next morning, bright and early, was Vermont Businesses for Social Responsibility had a breakfast where the theme, with also Marjorie Kelly, since she was still in town, and the theme was on integrating mission into ownership. So she gave a talk, and hopefully there was a camera there, so hopefully VBSR will be releasing some video from that talk. And as well as Will Rapp of Gardner Supply Company talked about employee ownership and kind of his experience with organizations that have both kind of been able to kind of keep close to their mission, but also organizations that have drifted from their missions, and kind of how the ownership structure can really play a big role in that. And then finally, there's a representative from the Department of Financial Regulation talking about sort of ways of financing kind of these alternative forms of ownership, and in particular highlighting that the Jobs Act, which allows for sort of crowdfunding,
Right.
Small-scale investment from people who are not like accredited investors.
Right.
And this is one of the really sort of weird parts of our economy that I think really gets in the way of more equitable distribution of ownership, is that in order to invest in anything but these institutional investments, you need to be certified that you have $1 million, $2 million in assets in order to be considered qualified to pursue things that have higher rates of return. And of course, if you only allow people to get a return on their capital who already have piles of money, you're going to see increasing inequalities of wealth.
Sure.
So this is going to be kind of an interesting thing that allows for a lot of smaller businesses to tap into communities of people who might be like, oh, well, I'll put $500 or $1,000 into this, but wouldn't individually be able to put like $20,000 or $50,000 or whatever the organization needs. And then Vermont also has like a version kind of that functions under state law for businesses that only accept investors in Vermont. So he kind of gave an interesting overview of these sort of new, both either recently established in the Vermont case and about to be established in the sort of National Jobs Act case.
Right.
Mechanisms for providing kind of this sort of more localized financing of business startups and businesses in general.
Yeah, that's going to be really interesting to watch. It sort of allows people to sort of organically support, businesses or ventures that align with their values, and also potentially opens up more capital to, maybe a venture that a financial institution wouldn't necessarily back.
Yeah, no, and it's definitely just one piece of a bigger issue, because as I've started this new job, I've had $1,000 from rolling over from a retirement fund I'd had at another job. I was like, it would be kind of cool since I'm the second employee there, so it's not like there's all these systems set up. Like it'd be cool if my retirement plan would allow me to put my retirement money in the Cooperative Fund of New England, which invests in new co-ops. It's like the rate of return is low, but it's doing something that fits with my values, and it would be a motivation for me to save money.
Right.
Because I'd be like, oh, I want that money, the match to be going towards investing in co-ops. Great.
Yeah.
And so I went down this odyssey of like, okay, how do I actually have a retirement account that doesn't just put my money in Wall Street, but actually puts it where my values are? And it turns out it's either expensive or impossible. So, if I wanted to get something called a self-directed IRA, it's like, $50 to start, and like a $200 a year fee plus an additional fee for every time you like buy or sell like something. So if I'm like, oh, I want to just deposit $50 in the Cooperative Fund of New England every pay period, I'd be basically paying all of that in fees to just do that. So there's definitely had some interesting email conversations with different people trying to figure out how to do this, and I'm still kind of working on it. But it seems like that this is like one of those possibilities where it's maybe bringing that kind of ethical investing into, to people who have little bits of money like me, rather than to just people who are like able to talk in the tens or hundreds of thousands of dollars.
Right. Yeah, I mean, there have been some interesting developments. There's a company online where you can sort of pool resources to fund solar development. So it sort of breaks down these like geographic limitations as well. That typically credit unions are generally based around a geographic scope of pooling capital, and this definitely opens up a lot of different doors.
So that was a really interesting conversation to go down the rabbit hole of. And one thing I was wondering, and so I asked a question to him, the person from the Department of Financial Regulation, because traditionally co-ops have been exempted from a lot of the kind of securities laws, and I just wanted to see, like, as this was going forward, if that would change things for co-ops. But according to him, pretty much the cooperative exemption for things like member loan programs and stuff like that is still in place and fine. So that was good to hear, because that's, I think, an important tool for co-ops that have allowed them to essentially do what we would now call crowdfunding, but
Right.
have been doing that for like 150 years under a different name.
Yeah, right, exactly.
But yeah, so overall that was a really, I thought, interesting and thought-provoking program, and I was happy I made it. And then that evening, we had a screening at Meglionero's put on by kind of the Cooperative Vermont sort of social committee plus the Green Mountain Worker Co-op Alliance and Meglionero. And it's this film that is from the 2012 Year of Cooperatives, about these college students biking across the country, visiting co-ops all along the way and kind of operating themselves, trying to operate kind of in a collective way, like governed way as they're traveling, and
Right.
the highs and the lows of that trip. And yeah, it was a fun movie, definitely kind of like a coming of age story, with all these 20-year-olds kind of going in with one set of ideas of who they are and what they're trying to accomplish and what they're doing, and then after 3 months of bicycling together, every day, ending the trip with a very different perspective on things. So it was a good both a good movie and good conversation afterwards. So that was a good way to kind of wrap up the New Economy Week events.
Yeah, and New Economy Week is relatively sort of new concept. I think it sort of kicked off maybe 3 years ago.
Mm-hmm. It replaced Old Economy Week.
And it's sort of interesting to see support for it broaden. Like you mentioned, VBSR putting on that event, and I was at the Gund Institute last week, and they had a banner out front for New Economy Week. So it's sort of been interesting to see the momentum build behind.
Yeah, and it's not super specific, but I think it's the sort of thing where it's kind of like an opportunity for all the people who are doing this kind of work on particular elements of this sort of these alternative economics that are looking at things from doing things a different way than the sort of dominant economic system is doing them.
Right.
To all sort of highlight what they're doing and say, all right, let's everyone do something this week, and we'll cross promote each other's thing, and all we'll all have the same hashtag, and
Yeah.
so hopefully next year it'll happen again and be even bigger. And October seems to be, though, this kind of generally all the things. It's we had International Credit Union Day.
Right.
It's Co-op Month. Turns out it's also Employee Ownership Month.
No.
So New Economy Week is
Fits
everything's
perfectly, yeah.
squished into October.
Cool. Yeah, I mean, hopefully it continues to build. It's definitely it's been exciting to watch.
So, in terms of other news, something that's a little less uplifting is the Hanover Co-op story.
Right.
So that's been a long-running saga at this point of for those who haven't been following, two kind of department managers were pretty much summarily fired, and then both they and kind of a group of members who supported them have kind of been challenging that firing, and it's gone back and forth in the press, the contentious board meetings, and so the latest installment is that these two former employees have filed suit against the co-op to sort of basically alleging wrongful termination due to age discrimination and kind of personal vindictiveness and things like that.
Yeah.
So it sounds like that's going to be moving things. The court is now going to be opening up as another kind of front in this fracas.
Yeah. It's we sort of cover the peaks and valleys of Vermont cooperatives on the show, but not the most uplifting story to follow. But it'll be interesting to watch, especially I think how the members sort of deal with this ordeal. As member owners, they have. They have the right to expect, their co-ops behave in a certain manner. So it'll be interesting to see how, that group that supports the fired employees, how the general membership sort of aligns.
And this is also one of those situations that I think really highlights one of the reasons why having a large base of members who really get the governance, how co-op governance works, is an important thing, even though oftentimes it's not in day-to-day operations terribly important.
Mhm.
But when a crisis comes up, or when something that really requires the use of the governance comes up, it's in a lot of these situations where most members are pretty disengaged. The time of crisis is the first time that they is at the same time the time that they're learning how that governance works. So it's not like they know, okay, I can go to the board, I can like call a special meeting, da 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 da. You know, they're kind of going into it with maybe half of their approach being as they would approach kind of a for-profit business.
Right.
And so it's a tricky thing because on the one hand, you know, it's difficult to get people engaged in sort of learning the process so that they know how to use it when they feel like they need to use it without that sense of urgency that comes with the crisis.
Mm-hmm.
But it also, you know, and it's like, okay, well, why should we put resources into doing that when we could be doing these other things? But it's the sort of thing that only really, I think, pays off when it's like, okay, well, all the members, they might be upset, but they know, you know, they know how to engage in an effective and empowered way, rather than kind of having to sort of negotiate that and really get to know who's on the board for the first time, maybe in that time of crisis too, rather than having sort of a trusting working relationship with the governance of their organizations or of their co-op. So I mean, yeah, watching this, and I've been watching occasionally when other fires break out, like at City Market when there's the language controversy, or I think Blooming Foods out in Indiana has been having some struggles over kind of a unionization thing and some issues with one member of their senior management, and it's kind of been going back and forth. And then there's this whole kind of Gainesville food co-op in Florida, where I think these are all examples of, you know, this can be a serious vulnerability for a co-op if its membership really, you know, doesn't have a strong, trusting, working relationship with its governance when a crisis hits.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, I agree, and it's, you know, I think in many ways it's just sort of the fallout that member owners, cooperatives are so, you know, small portion of businesses related, you know, than the typical consumer relationship, that it's the member education that a co-op needs to put into what it means to be a member owner is really important. You know, it's a role in sort of developing, you know, a cooperative society. So it'll be interesting to see how this continues to play out.
But you know, on another news front is to go from down to up, although it is maybe a little bit of a downer, is the Co-op Brewpub project. So we've been continuing to chug along on that, hanging out around, I think, 70 pledged members. It had a really productive this weekend. There's been a couple of meetings. The brewing working group got together to really hammer out some of their governance and processes that really had been established in a very vague way early on. So now they're kind of formalizing a lot of stuff, which is exciting. And then today we had a gathering to work on logo stuff and made a lot of progress. So there's kind of clear next steps as to what needs to be done on that logo process, and also a couple of G, who's one of the members of the little committee, by the end of the thing had kind of a draft of what she's kind of her proposal for one, and someone else has an idea for one that he's going to be working on in the next week. So we'll probably have a few different proposed drafts on the table.
Cool.
And the deadline is the 2nd. So if anyone who's watching and is interested in being involved in this particular process of the Brewpub project, if you're not a volunteer, you can go to fullbarrel.coop to sign up to pledge to become a member and join the volunteer list. But if you already are, you know, that's so there's going to be some emails floating around. But the deadline will be the 2nd of November. And it's looking like we're going to be doing our next brew day on the 15th. Things are still a little bit up in the air in terms of location. We have a possible location, but we need to figure out insurance if we can, you know, get that working, or So there's like some logistical things that still need to be worked out. So, but it's looking like the 15th of November will be our next kind of brew day and member meeting, and we'll hopefully have, you know, either a final logo or maybe 2 logos at that to be voting on, and after which we can maybe start having T-shirts and hoodies and
Yeah, and pint glasses.
yeah, oh yeah, all sorts of swag for the wintertime. So again, if folks want to kind of keep up on the latest in that project, the website is fullbarrel.coop.
And last time that we were on the show, we hit on your trip to the CU Water Cooler Conference, and you mentioned that one of the highlights was this talk by William Azeroff, and I don't know if we have it here, and I don't know if you want to sort of give it any more introduction to the to the
Yeah,
talk.
so William Azeroff is the Director of Business and Community Development for Van City Credit Union, and I was really impressed by this talk. I've been really impressed by them, and they've done sort of a lot of stuff that's really sort of engaging with the larger co-op movement, which is sometimes a rarity in the credit union space.
Yeah.
And not just that, but also been like pretty creative in the sorts of programs they've implemented. So I think this talk by William Azeroff I was really impressed by it, and I'm happy to be sharing it here. And we'll also be talking a little bit more about the stuff that Van City does after this, because actually last week I was in Quebec City for the International Summit of Cooperatives, and there was a lot of different takeaways from that. But one of the biggest actually was me. It's like me being even more impressed with what Van City is doing from my encounter with some of their board members and employees and people who've kind of worked with programs that have been supported by them. So.
Mm-hmm.
So we'll watch this video of William Azeroff giving a talk. It's about 20 minutes. When we get back, we'll discuss a little bit of of my Quebec adventures. So stick around.
Thanks, Sherry. Thanks, everybody. I'll get Sherry back by saying that yesterday when I saw her when I checked into the hotel, she called me her favorite Canadian, so I'm sure that'll cause problems amongst her other favorite Canadians. So I'm really excited to talk today about co-ops. It's a nice continuation from our conversations yesterday, and it's a story I want to share that I call Sawdust, Empty Bottles, and Mustaches. And I think that for a lot of us who work in co-ops, we know some things about co-ops, but at Van City, we've been thinking a lot about co-ops for a while, and this story kind of emerged for me. I'm excited. This is the first time I've shared it, so you'll let me know what y'all think. So when we think about the early days of co-ops, we have to go back to the Industrial Revolution. And so the conditions of people in the Industrial Revolution were very, very different, and understanding that context is really important to understanding how co-ops came about. So the life of people in this day and age was very hard. The things we take for granted today, like a 5-day work week and child labor laws, didn't exist. They came about because of these conditions, because people worked very hard in very difficult conditions, and basically to be employed in a factory, a mine, any kind of industrial revolution job meant that you were exploited. And one of the ways in which you were exploited was that if you worked in a company town and you stayed in the company barracks, you probably shopped at a place like this. You probably shopped at the company store, which meant that whatever paycheck you took home, whatever payment you received for your hard work, you were forced to shop here because you lived in a little city by the river where the mill was, and you had no other options. And I'm sure there are some company stores that were very ethical and did a good job for their customers, but many of them knew they had a trapped base of customers and didn't feel any obligation to do right by them. And one of the things that they did that pissed off 13 men in Rochdale, England, was that when you went to the company store to buy flour for your family to make bread, you thought you were buying 3 pounds of flour. But in reality, you were probably buying maybe 2.5 pounds of flour, and you were getting half a pound of sawdust. You were paying for 3 pounds, you were getting 3 pounds in a bag, but you were not receiving what you paid for. And so there were 13 men in Rochdale, England, who decided to take matters into their own hands, who decided to start the first modern cooperative. It's not the first co-op, but it's the first co-op that we can look back and say, yeah, there's a straight line between the principles and the practices they set in motion and co-ops today. And so one of the things that they did was they set up this store here on Toad Lane. And so this was the first modern co-op. And they had one goal above all others, which was to sell pure unadulterated food at fair prices and honest weights and measures. And there's a lot in this one sentence about making sure that people got what they paid for, about always having a fair price, that you knew that you were going to get a fair price, you're going to pay a fair price for what you bought, which was not the case at other places. Even the idea of pure unadulterated food, you were getting food that hadn't been tampered with, you were getting food to feed your family that was nutritious. And the idea of honest weights and measures, what you bought, what you wanted was what you got. And this idea of honest weights and measures is a really important one. And if we look at that sentence and unpack it, you can see the correlation between the context of these men's lives and modern cooperative principles. The idea of it being voluntary. So much of these people's lives was involuntary. To work meant you're basically an indentured servant. It meant that you didn't voluntarily shop where you wanted to shop, pick the hours you wanted to pick, live the life you wanted to live. It meant that they wanted their workplace to be democratic. They wanted to have some say so it could reflect the changing needs of their community, that they could run things the way they felt things needed to be run and be usurped and pushed out of the way if they were no longer doing a good job. The idea of economic participation, when I think about economic participation at co-ops, I think about you have shares, so therefore you receive a part of the surplus. You receive patronage or dividends. But economic participation is actually much more critical than that. It was reciprocity because the capital that these people used to start their company came from the members. That $5, that $50, that $500, whatever the kind of co-op you're joining that you put in is the capital that company has to work with. And so economic participation both meant receiving the benefits if that co-op was profitable, but it also meant putting money in, having some skin in that game, which is super important. The idea of autonomy and independence, they weren't relying on government, they weren't relying on anybody else, they could be independent and look after their own needs. These first four co-op principles really set the stage for the kind of governance that these men felt they needed in light of the exploitation they were facing. But they went on from there. They thought about education, because if you worked in a mine or you worked in a factory and suddenly you were helping to run a co-op, you need to know how to look at a balance sheet. You need to know how to run a business. And if you were to help this nascent co-op movement move forward, you had to understand the rules and principles of a cooperative, so you ran it according to those principles and not as a for-profit or a corporate structure. So education is really important to enshrine. If you're starting a movement, you want the movement to work in amongst each other. So cooperation amongst cooperatives is important. If you're going to do business with other organizations, why not do business with other cooperatives? We saw the yesterday when Carlos was talking, this worker co-op that he helped spin out of his Cooperation Texas organization is a housekeeping service, a worker co-op run by maids. And some of their early contracts are with other co-ops. And I would challenge all of us in the room, beyond the money we give away as community donations, there's also procurement dollars. And what portion of our procurement dollars could be spent at co-ops in our area to help build that reciprocity and start engaging with other co-ops? And finally, community. But I love the wording here. It's concern for community. At co-ops and credit unions, we do a lot of good community engagement, a lot of good community activity, and that's all good. But if we have concern for community, if we're looking at the deepest needs in our community, of looking after people with barriers to employment, of looking at the gap between rich and poor, of looking at environmental catastrophes happening in our community, like Linda talked about yesterday. If we have real concern for community, it might drive different kinds of work in community than we do today. It's not just engaging and nice to have stuff, it is essential caring for community. So today, the equivalent of sawdust is that I think about areas that are food deserts, usually impoverished areas. We have them in Vancouver, you have them in America, we have them anywhere. And they're areas that for-profit grocery stores no longer see profitability in these communities, they've pulled out. And so people who live there who are time-strapped, resource-strapped, cash-strapped, don't maybe have the ability to get 6 miles down the road to shop at the nearest grocery store. They may not even have a car, they're relying on public transit. And they've got $15 to feed their family, that's all they have. And so what options do they have? The most immediate option is fast food. And so when you think about fast food, you go there, and we know fast food isn't that healthy, but they advertise themselves having 100% ground beef, and if you don't have a lot of money, you go there and you think, okay, at least I'm making a choice for my family. But the equivalent of sawdust is when you're buying 100% ground beef, what you're getting mixed into that beef is pink slime, right? You're not getting something that's quite as advertised. You're getting something different. The honest weights and measures, the pure unadulterated food doesn't come into practice. And so I've been here 3 times in Austin in the last 2 months and 3 different conferences. And the first one was a co-op conference, and after the conference was over, it was a conference kind of like this one. It was just a great social event. It was a really great learning opportunity. And a bunch of us met each other at the airport on the way out, and we gathered at the gate. And this guy that I hadn't actually met the whole conference said this thing as a throwaway, and I thought it was brilliant. When you think about the Rochdale pioneers, when you think about the genesis stories of your own cooperatives and credit unions, I think this is really interesting. No one ever started a co-op who wasn't pissed off. Right? So I think that's an important essence to what we're doing, which is that if you see a company that's doing well, you think you can make a slightly higher margin, great, do it. But it's probably not a good business case for a co-op. But if you've got a city, post-war Vancouver, and you can't get mortgages east of Cambie, and you've knocked on every door and no one will help you, your last resort is being pissed off, fine, we'll do it for ourselves. The genesis of co-ops is usually a group of fishermen, of teachers, of whatever, who are not able to get their needs met, and so they do for themselves what no one else would do. There's a bit of that essence of being a little bit pissed off. There's a bit of that activist approach. And when we lose that, I worry a little. Now, the antidote to pink slime is being able to look your food in the face. Is buying food from a place that has at least a dual or maybe a triple bottom line. Of course they're out to make money. That's fine, that's good. But they also care about the quality of food they serve, and they're proud of the food they serve. They know what goes into the food, and they know what they're providing to you. And maybe they even have an environmental focus around the methane in the case of a rancher. But they have a motive, a mission, beyond pure maximizing profit. And there's room for both to coexist, and we have to know as consumers, we have to know as cooperators what we're doing around the choices we make. You can't buy a co-op-made iPhone, and that's okay, that's good. But you can, when you're buying food for your family, think about the choices of who's making this food and what's their motive. Now in Texas, I took this picture a couple of trips ago. You have the great Wheatsville Food Co-op. And Wheatsville Food Co-op, enacting principle number 5, wants to educate its members around what they're buying, around how much local food they have, around how much organic food they have. They have picks of the week depending on what's in season. They're very proud to display this because they want people to know what they're buying. When we look at our context, the first person in North America to apply these cooperative principles was, and here's the same photo coincidentally Matt used yesterday, is Desjardins. So he was sick of watching people get into cycles of debt that they couldn't get out of, and he wanted to do something about it. So he took the cooperative principles and applied them to financial services. And when I think about pink slime in our industry, I think about payday lenders. So here's an example. This building is an old Bank of Montreal building. It's a gorgeous building. It's only a few blocks from Van City head office, and it's been turned into a payday lender. Now, what Ron said yesterday is really true and important, which is consumers aren't dumb and they have a choice. This is a growing industry. They're meeting needs. So when we think about ourselves, if we're enacting Principle 5, educating our members, if we're enacting Principle 7, concern for community, then we should look at people who maybe don't have a choice. They need money today and their paycheck isn't coming until next Friday. They're in a bind. And if they come to a credit union, and the credit union says, yeah, you know, we have to apply for a loan, it'll take 3 days, whatever it's going to take, then we're not meeting their needs. So of course they're going to go there, and once they're there, some of them do fine, it's a service, but many get trapped in the cycle of debt. And so if we think about it, if we're financially educating our members, if we adhere to Principle 5 and make financial literacy a core, and if we're adhering to this idea of concern for community, then we're probably going to create an alternative so that people have a choice. That they have a choice between going to a payday lender, and if they choose to do so, that's their choice. But if they know what they're getting into, eyes wide open, and they see they have another option at their credit union where they can get the money today that they need today because they can't make it to payday, and they can do it at a fair rate where we can make some profit and serve their need, and our goal is not simple maximizing profit for a group of shareholders, but it is a dual or a triple bottom line, it's a mission mixed with the margin, then we can meet the needs of these people. And what co-ops do best, and we talked about this yesterday, is uncovering hidden markets. If we know our members, if we know our communities, if we're doing that work to get out in our communities and meet people and talk to people and meet not-for-profits and co-ops and social enterprises serving the need of our community, then we're going to see opportunities and meet needs before others will. If we're not meeting needs, then either we're doing great, we're meeting all the needs and that's fantastic, or we're just not doing any better than banks. Because if our members are just really customers, then we're not going to be able to serve them any differently. It is by engaging with them deeply and understanding them that we can make a difference. Now, I want to tell you a story. I want to tell you a story of cooperation of someone who's actually in some ways not a cooperator. This is Ken Leodier. In Vancouver, he's a hero to many. He's a hero of mine. And he started an organization about 20 some odd years ago called United We Can. And United We Can is an organization where people, binners, people who are dumpster divers, who go out and find things that we throw away that still have value, aka pop cans and such that are returnable for a refund. And he galvanized them together, and he moved them he's a social enterprise, but he acts in the most cooperative ways, working with levels of government, working with different organizations. Van City is incredibly proud to have supported him since day one, and he's a proud Van City member. We lent him money recently to relocate to a much bigger establishment, and he hires people who today are very industrious and hardworking, but for various reasons can't hold a job in a traditional setting. There are barriers to employment for the most part, and they are earning money from very hard work. They remind me a little of the people from the Industrial Revolution, even looking at them. And they earn a living, and they can have a place to live and stay off the streets and work at the hours they need to work and take care of the things that they have going on in their lives. And Ken calls them part of the resource extraction industry, which I find hilarious. The idea that they're kind of urban miners, extracting pieces of value where others aren't seeing them. And so supporting organizations like this, finding that hidden market and supporting organizations that they have grown tremendously, they're a profitable social enterprise. This is a profitable relationship for both of us, and we can support organizations like that. Cooperation Texas, who we heard from yesterday, helping people start worker co-ops so they own the means to have jobs with dignity. And we saw a number of examples when we met with them, when I met with them on a previous trip, where they were spitting out worker co-ops. This young woman who's a maid who didn't want to be exploited and was really fearful of exploitation got together 3 other maids much older than her, and they started this worker co-op. And they have the first generation of employees who now have vested and can buy in if they so choose and become worker owners of the co-op. Totally different means of production. And she could take pride in her work because the previous employer was pushing her to do 7, 8 homes in a day, which means you don't do a good job. And they've got a cap on how many they'll do so they can take pride in their work and do a good job. Now I want to switch gears and talk about something very different. Most of us in this room probably own a drill. And the interesting thing about a drill is that in the lifetime you own a drill, you use it on average 14 minutes. And yet we all own one. We don't actually use it that often. And technology is allowing for this thing called idling capacity. This idea that you don't all need to own your own drills. I think about my square block and how many lawnmowers must be on it. And it's crazy, we probably need 3. If we had the means to share it efficiently, that we don't need that many lawnmowers. So in Vancouver, we have an organization, a cooperative that started up called the Vancouver Tool Library. So instead of owning a drill, you can go there and borrow a drill. And by the way, for your membership share, you can also borrow all sorts of crazy equipment that you'd never be able to afford or need to buy or be able to store in your home, but you can get it when you need it. And of course, I need not say, it's a Van City member. We're proud to support them, and we have a reciprocal relationship where we bank them, and they're growing, and we're all doing well together. Another great example of idling capacity is your car. Probably the second most expensive thing you own, and yet the average car sits idle 23 hours a day. That's ridiculous. It's a waste of resources. So in Vancouver in 1997, this organization started called Moto, and I'm newly elected by its members to its board. And it's a great organization that has a focus on sharing cars, 10,000 drivers, 300 some odd cars scattered around the Lower Mainland that people can access when they want. For a family like ours, it means we don't have to have a second car. For many families, it means they don't have to have a first car. Between transit and bike lanes and this whole infrastructure, including Moto, they can get around. And of course, again, Van City supported them since day one, and they're a member, and we do all kinds of cooperative things together because we have a shared mission. We have shared interest in serving community. Now, technology is enabling other examples of this, like Lyft. If you've got a car and you've got time on your hands, you can stick this cute little pink mustache on your front of your car and log into the app and say, I'm available, and you can log into your app and say, I need a ride, and I'll give you a ride someplace. And that's awesome. But I want to say this. I want to say that structure matters. That Modo, part of its charter, is concern for the environment, is getting cars off the road to reduce congestion, to reduce carbon emissions. It's got a bottom line other than maximizing shareholder value. So we have choices, and both are valid and good, and it's good that they coexist. But for some people, Modo is going to be a much better choice for them based on their personal ethics and values, based on their needs, than Lyft. And so they can coexist. I just want to get into a few facts about co-ops. We think of co-ops as being these really small, kind of the corner food co-op, the corner bookstore co-op. But the reality is, from the research I did, the US has 30,000 co-ops with 256 million members. So what that means, and it's exactly what we talked about yesterday, most Americans are members of a co-op. And if they don't realize it, that probably doesn't mean we need to educate them on what a co-op is. It might. It probably means we don't behave like co-ops, so they don't sense the difference. And so some of these people may have just stayed in a Best Western, which is a marketing co-op, and have no idea that it's a co-op, and they don't need to know. But some of them may actually belong to a co-op and not realize it, and many of them hopefully do. If we look around the world, we're a huge industry. When I was in Bologna, Italy, visiting co-ops in 2009, I met with a huge multinational cooperative. You walked in this place, you would not believe they're a co-op. And then we sat down in their boardroom, the nicest boardroom I've ever been in, and you start talking about values. And all of a sudden, their values are the same as ours. We shared those values. 1.6 trillion is the collective revenue of co-ops, and we're collectively one of the top 10 global economies. So when we go back home, our opportunity is simple, which is we need to look at our landscape and discover the hidden markets in our communities, find out what's really going on, and see how we can meet the needs. We've got to be curious. How do you start a reciprocal relationship? You start by asking what I can do for you. So I want to leave you with one last image. I want to think of an image that sort of summarized what I'm trying to say. And I thought of this. Here's that little Toad Lane first co-op, but it's now a museum. And they've added on this really nice modern wing. You've got the old-fangled with the newfangled. You've got something historical and valuable that has proven the test of time, but it's enshrouded by something modern. And that's, I think, exactly what we need to be and what we need to do. We need to hold on to those values that have proven over time, but we need to adjust ourselves for the age we live in today. So with that, let's discuss.
William Azarov giving a talk at the CU Water Cooler Symposium in Austin, Texas, about a month ago now at this point. Any reactions to the talk?
Well, I think he really hit on this what can be a struggle for co-ops is becoming too driven by sort of just the economics of things versus being driven by meeting needs and sort of having the confidence that if you're meeting the needs, then you're gonna make money. But not necessarily being driven by that motive. And yeah, I think as he showed there, there's a lot of opportunities for co-ops. It sort of fits in well to what we were talking about with the Jobs Act and stuff. That as technology changes, more opportunities become available, people's needs change, and that sort of co-ops need to be flexible to that to be successul.
Mm-hmm. I think for me, like that hidden markets thing, that's a really cool idea. It's taps you into that kind of like the really digging into that the relationship with the cooperators, with the members, and saying like, okay, well, like members, someone who's a customer doesn't have really any strong incentive to surrender or give up information about what their needs are. But suddenly when you've created a situation where, as he said, the structure matters, where the structure makes the organization trustworthy, then suddenly all these little possibilities that would otherwise be invisible can be made transparent to the organization and can act on those. And that's a potential source of tremendous strength, but it's one that is only accessible if one actually doesn't just talk the talk on values, but really walks the walk and does kind of creates an organization that is about truly meeting member needs and understanding and communicating with members in a deep and authentic way.
Yeah, it was a bit of a challenge to co-ops. Do members not know what a co-op is, or are we not acting like a co-op? And I think that's a really appropriate thing to be thinking about.
Yeah. So I was excited to have the opportunity to dig a little bit more on what Van City's doing and have kind of continue these conversations when I went up to Quebec, not last week, but the week before. So I was there for the kind of World Summit of Cooperatives, and I was fortunate to get kind of a bit of a sort of discount on my admission because I was part of the Young Leaders Program. So if you're under 35 years old, you can qualify for this. And in addition, I was in a conference center right outside of the old city of Quebec, and I was staying in a hostel right inside the wall. So it was about a 5-minute walk between the two, which was super convenient.
Cool.
And so, in addition to all these different sessions, both like big plenary sessions with thousands of people in a room, and a few people talking about a particular topic on stage, there were also for the young leaders, there were breakfasts on particular themes, with breaking out into the table that you're sitting with to discuss the topic at hand. And there was kind of like an evening party one of the nights where we all went out to to kind of a bar and had snacks and drinks, and then broke out into groups where some of the members of the program who are working on particular projects got to present about exactly what they've been doing, and digging into that. And there's also a kind of, there's some of the sort of a portion of the group was had some critiques about exactly how the conference was sort of organized, particularly around sort of the prevalence of more sort of kind of white, sort of European and American kind of white men dominating a lot of the sessions and being really the only voices being heard in the big things. So a group kind of broke off and held a big brainstorming session about halfway into the conference for the young attendees to talk about what it was that they wanted to be getting out of it, what they felt like as young people the co-op movement should be doing, and to sort of bring young people into the governance process and the sort of participation in the movement. And that kind of there are a lot of different elements to it, but things such as like access to resources, the idea of kind of bringing people up within the co-op movement, and so this all kind of ended with, or kind of came out in a statement that was presented, and a lot of people, myself included, signed the statement. And you can find, if you just look around, it's actually the International Cooperative Alliance then posted the statement on their webpage, and it really kind of floated around. So it got some play. So that was quite an interesting piece of the trip, to kind of be part of that, because that wasn't a planned thing. It was something where we all kind of gathered in this sort of open space within the conference center and broke into groups and basically had an assembly, and it was an autonomous assembly, and it was pretty cool to be part of. Also got to, I tended to skip the lunches and went out and stuffed myself full of poutine. What with being in Quebec City, I was gonna avoid gravy and cheese curds on top of fries, right?
Right.
But some of the other sessions that were interesting. There's one I went to that was kind of some research that's been done on co-ops, and particularly looking at like member concerns, member loyalty, member perceptions of co-ops in different countries around the world. And one of the interesting things I found about that was, despite the fact that in the U.S. it seems like there's less engagement with co-ops than somewhere like Canada and many European countries. Americans' perceptions of co-ops, like this is a survey of like 10 countries, or they surveyed the same number of people in each country. Americans' perceptions of co-ops tended to be the highest in basically every category they looked at. So Americans thought the most of co-ops of any of these countries, which was, it was the thing was in French, so I didn't really get a chance to sort of ask further about why that was, but that was kind of definitely interesting and maybe encouraging, although it might also be, my perception that co-ops are less prevalent in the U.S. than in other places might be anecdotal and not fully true. But so that was interesting to delve into. Then there's some kind of sessions on specific topics, talking about people's experiences around the world. So talking about one really interesting one was about kind of conversions to worker co-ops, and people from different parts of the world talking about what that process looks like. There's a woman actually from Cuba. At the end of 2012, the Cuban government passed a law allowing some state-owned industries to be transitioned to worker co-ops. So in the U.S., it's mostly like it goes from sort of a private owner to a worker co-op. So it's very interesting to hear about sort of the original owner, that being the state bureaucracy rather than a private owner. So it's kind of a different experience, but sort of in some ways, but similar outcomes of people who work there feeling more empowered, and there being a flatter hierarchy versus the boss being essentially a civil servant, and sort of drop off in like theft at work and all the things that you see just kind of from employee ownership in general. And other sort of experiences, talking about in Quebec. One interesting little tidbit or observation was from, I think it was the Quebec experience, was that unionized workplaces tended to have an easier time culturally transitioning to becoming a worker co-op, because the employees were already used to the idea of kind of voting on certain things that had to do with their workplace, like voting on a contract or something like that. So it wasn't as big of a jump, the identity from being just an employee to an employee owner versus going from being a union employee to an employee owner. So that was kind of an interesting little piece. And then there's a session on kind of best practices in governance and talking about getting people from different perspectives. So there's the head of actually the Asian sort of, or the just retired head of the Association of like Asian Credit Unions, who was up there quoting Ray Fison, who's one of the German like fathers of the credit union movement from like the 1850s and 60s, and someone from basically there's a co-op in Canada called Mountain Equipment Co-op, MEC, which is literally, so someone was like, they literally just took REI and copied it in the Canadian context, and now like they're Canada's biggest co-op. They have 4-point-something million members, and so the person who's kind of in charge of governance for them, she had some really interesting perspectives on what is success in governance in a co-op. How do you sort of, how do you engage members, things like that, and really sort of making the point that it's like, okay, they have 50,000 members vote, but out of 4-point-something million, that's like 1% participation. Is that just kind of asking the rhetorical question: is that something to be proud of? Is that something that needs to be improved on? And is it important? But so a point that she really hit on is it's important that for all the members who you send out these things, and there's members who will read the newsletter, and then there's members who will actually participate in voting, and there's levels of like active engagement. But she made the important point of the very active like presenting those things, even if members don't necessarily engage. What's communicated is that those things are there, and that for every member who actually votes, a lot of members, it's communicated to that if you wanted to, if there's an issue that you were passionate about that was at play here, your participation would be welcome too. And so that in and of itself, sure, she really made a good argument for that it changes that relationship. And then I got to hang out a lot with a lot of British Columbia credit unions, not just Van City, although I have kind of got to crash a Van City party and talk to people who came from one really interesting program that they have, in which they have basically a training program where for 8 months or so, people kind of learn about alternative business, specifically looking at the cooperative model and social enterprise and things like that. And when they finish that, then that's funded by the Van City Foundation. That Van City gives money to the foundation. And then those people coming out with this kind of certificate then have the potential to work with Van City as a lender to start something like a worker co-op, or, so I met someone who was part of a woodworking co-op that had been started through that project. I met someone from a bicycle messenger co-op. I met someone who was in the process of getting a startup wireless kind of phone company. That's the goal is for it to be a consumer co-op, getting that off the ground there. So it was really interesting to see Van City taking on this role, further, as he was talking about in the talk we watched earlier. But other instances of ways that Van City is really taking on this role of, developing the cooperative economy in their economic territory.
So this program is for folks involved in in other cooperative ventures. It's like an education program for those folks.
Yes, or people who are maybe not even involved in cooperative ventures yet, but would be who are maybe entrepreneurial. And for most people, when you think about starting a business, you're thinking about starting something as a sole proprietorship that you could just sell to someone else once it gets big enough and you walk away with your pile of money. But so this is kind of a way of taking people who are maybe idealistic and giving them both some practical hard business skills, but also sort of presenting them with this alternative model of entrepreneurship, which is really interesting, and it was inspiring and they were actually some of the few, this one of the critiques actually that came out of the youth group was this conference was because of its prohibitive cost. Without the young person discount, it would have been $1,500 to register. It tended to be dominated by people from large, well-established co-ops. So you didn't see people from new co-ops, you didn't see people from small co-ops. And these people who I met through Van City were actually an exception to this rule because Van City was, in their relationship, it was like set aside a certain number of bursaries to be like, okay, we'll pay for your registration if you'd like to come out to this. And that made it affordable for some people from smaller worker co-ops in the Vancouver area to attend this big international gathering, which was very cool, but it was also something where, compared to things like big financial, insurance, that sort of thing, co-ops, were way more represented than people from that sector of the cooperative economy generally, with the exception of Vancouver.
That's really cool. And are they also sort of doing stuff to support emerging employee ownership, like in terms of funding and
I couldn't speak to employee ownership specifically. I think in terms of transitions, the people I was talking to were mostly from kind of more like things that were starting from scratch as co-ops. But that's definitely something I'd be curious to dig into about them. And one other thing, and we're running a little short on time, so they kind of set up a specific organization for people who are experiencing homelessness and extremely economically marginal who would otherwise be using check cashers. Basically a branch of their credit union that is run by, or it has a different name, but it's run by street outreach workers. And so who are sort of in the dual role of being essentially bank tellers, but also street outreach workers. And so that was a kind of cool sort of program that I heard a little bit about from one of their board members.
Wow, that sounds really cool.
Yeah, so they're doing some really experimental, interesting things, and they're definitely, I think, I'd left that even more firmly convinced that they're really a model that credit unions across North America should be looking at as, an example of like what can be done.
Cool, very cool.
All right, so it looks like we're just about out of time, but you've been watching Cooperative Vermont. If you want to catch up on the co-op news, and in the meantime when we're not doing the show, which is every 2 weeks, we usually put up some news on the Cooperative Vermont Facebook page. Just search for it, you'll find that, and you can find old episodes on our YouTube channel. So until next show, I'm Matthew Cropp.
And I'm Eric Davis.
Good night.